So next up, we have Caitlin Abdou. Caitlin Abdou is an emerging author and fantasy enthusiast. Her debut novella, The Unseelie Prince, is the first in her series, The Hawthorne Throne. And we're going to take a moment here to switch seats because Caitlin is the only other human that I don't live with in my pod. And so don't be afraid for COVID reasons. Hold on just a moment. Caitlin will be with you in a second.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about the awkward switcheroo. So I am going to be talking about world building, specifically hard versus soft world building. So let me just get my little screen shared here, and I can start. Okay, so all right, so I'm going to talk about hard world building, specifically hard versus soft world building. This is not going to be like a how-to world build. If you do have questions about that, I can talk about that a little bit afterwards, and I can send out some recommendations. But this is mostly going to be talking about the two different methods. So to start out, what is world building? World building is a process of actually creating the universe that your story is set in. So without, the world around your characters, they just exist in like a blank space. So you need to create a world for your characters to exist within so that your readers and your watchers, if you're writing like a show or something, can understand kind of what's going on around them. And not only that, it's not just the visual world, but it's the structure of the world. So, how do the laws work? If you have a magic system, how does that work? Which method is better? There really is no answer to that. It's whichever method is better for you, but we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to be talking about the differences between them. I'm going to talk about some examples of each, and I'm going to be kind of specifically concentrating on certain authors and books. And we're going to talk about which method works for your story. We're going to touch on it just a little bit because that's really something you kind of have to figure out on your own. But I will talk about how to figure out which one you want to use. So I'm going to start off with hard world building. Hard world building is pretty much what you're all familiar with if you read fantasy. It's the most common. It's kind of like the start of the whole sci-fi fantasy worlds. Some examples of hard world building are obviously the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit series by J.R.R. Tolkien. In fact, he's kind of considered like the father of hard world building, or like the textbook example of it. And I think anybody that knows what it is understands that, but we're going to be talking about why. Another great example is A Song of Fire and Ice, or the Game of Thrones series by George R.R. Martin. And lastly, another fantastic example is the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn series by Ted Williams. The first book in the series is called The Dragonbone Chair. Some people just refer to it as the Dragonbone Chair books. But actually, these books were what inspired George R.R. Martin to go on and write the Game of Thrones books. So, little fun fact. All right, so hard world building uses believable and grounded worlds and concrete rules in order to immerse your readers. So you build up a very realistic and believable world so that they can immediately immerse themselves because they feel familiar with it. You're going to, if you're using hard world building, you're going to be using realism and logic in order to create your world. And hard world building makes your world into a character. And I'm going to be talking about what I mean by that in just a minute, but I wanted to point that out on the first page because it's kind of important. All right, so this is actually a fantastic example. This specific quote, I'm sure you're all going to be very familiar with this quote, but this is a great example of how hard world building actually makes your world into a character. So one does not simply walk into Mordor. Its black gates are guarded by more than just orcs. There is evil there that does not sleep, and the Great Eye is ever watchful. It is a barren wasteland riddled with fire and ash and dust, and the very air you breathe a poisonous fume. Not with 10,000 men could you do this. Obviously, if you know, this is Boromir from The Lord of the Rings, from the second book, The Fellowship of the Ring. And this is a great example of how like just Mordor or Middle Earth is a character of its own. It has an entire personality of its own. So I thought it was really important to touch on that quote. All right, so hard world building, concrete rules. Hard world building has concrete rules when you're creating your world. This does not mean that it has like a steadfast set of rules you have to follow, but when you create your world is going to have concrete rules about it that are not questionable. A fantastic example with J.R.R. Tolkien is languages. J.R.R. Tolkien loved language. It was one of his personal loves, one of his hobbies in his personal life. He created multiple languages, but Elvish is kind of the most famous one. I think every 12-year-old geek that was like around when these movies came out learned how to speak Elvish. Like I know I did. But Elvish is actually an entire language with sentence syntax, grammar. It has different spellings and pronunciations. He actually created an entire proper language that you can learn and speak, and there are even apps to learn how to speak it today. So there are complex histories and politics in your hard world building world. I'm saying the word world a lot. So a great example of that is Gondor versus Rohan, or the dwarves versus the elves. These are two constant conflicts that come up in the Lord of the Rings books. Obviously, if you're familiar with them, Gondor and Rohan are the two kingdoms of men that are kind of at odds with one another often. And the dwarves versus elves have a constant hate of each other that is brought up time and time again, unless you watch the Hobbit movies, in which case they kind of broke that rule, but we don't have to talk about that today. There are systematic racial and social hierarchies in a lot of these hard world building worlds. So right back to that other example, men versus elves versus dwarves versus hobbits, everybody falls into a certain place in this social hierarchy. Men kind of consider themselves to be at the top, but I think everybody kind of considers elves to be at the top. The dwarves and the elves are always at each other's throats. And then you just have the hobbits kind of chilling off to the side, doing their own thing. But everybody fits in where they should, and you know when you're reading a story where everybody fits in. So if you're introduced to a character and you find out, oh, this character is an elf, so obviously they're kind of up there, they're important, they're immortal, and you know that when you're introduced to them because you know the rules of that world. Hard world building is often heavy with detail. Obviously, I've already talked about like all these different details that go into it. Not only that, but there are maps and complex geographies and all this stuff. There's tons and tons of detail in them, and that can actually become a flaw or a difficulty, and I will talk about why later. But I say a lot, sorry. Detail is very important with hard world building. So logical and realistic themes, and what I mean by this is oftentimes when you see hard world building worlds like the Lord of the Rings or the Six of Crows duology, like the whole Grishaverse by Leigh Bardugo, that is all very comparable to our world now. So in the Grishaverse, you have different countries that are directly related to countries we know now. You know, you have Russia, you have Germany, Asia, and in Middle Earth, a lot of these kind of line up with our current, when he was alive, our society. And that makes it easier for you to relate to this world because it's so similar to our own. Like, yes, there are dragons, there are dwarves and orcs and elves, but it's not that dissimilar from your own society, so you immediately kind of understand it. And like I was saying before, the world is a character. And I touched on that with that quote, but what I mean by this is that there's so much detail to your world that your story could not exist without it. It's an essential main character in your story. And that's not to say that the world is not important with soft world building, but it comes across very differently. And I will discuss that when I kind of hop over to soft world building. So next I'm going to talk about the method. How do you create your hard world built worlds? So how can you use hard world building to create your worlds? When hard world building, you want to share as much detail as possible. So you are going to spend a lot of time creating your world. I mean, Tolkien spent 20 years. You don't have to spend 20 years, but definitely expect to shave out a good year to just go into the detail that you want to share in this story. With that, however, you do want to be careful when you're actually writing that you don't fall into that pitfall of dropping a huge info dump on your readers and losing them. I think that is one of the more difficult parts of hard world building. And I think that is a flaw that can often come up with it. And I'm not trying to say that it's not as good as soft world building. They are both great methods and very different, but this just happens to be a difficulty that hard world building falls into, where you'll have pages and pages and pages of description, and that's great, but you've suddenly stopped your story to say it. So you have to have the skill to pepper in the details without boring your reader. You create believability with complex histories. And we already talked about that. Gondor and Rohan, the dwarves versus the elves. You want to have these kind of classic tropes of how the world works that people can relate to. So you have believable social hierarchies that we understand now because we have social hierarchies, whether they're good or bad, they exist. Hard world building leaves little room for speculation. And I kind of touched on that earlier, but what I mean is that your reader has no reason to question anything that you're telling them because they already understand the world. So they're not going to question things that happen as long as you do your job correctly. Hard world building also uses plausibility and total immersion. And again, I touched on this earlier, but when I say it uses plausibility, I mean you understand it. It's plausible, it's realistic because it kind of is a mirror of your own life. And when I say total immersion, I mean you are immersed in it because there's so much detail and it's so relatable to you that you just understand the world, and the reader is often pulled right into the story. So now I'm going to hop over to soft world building. And now soft world building has kind of a special place in my heart. I'm going to try not to lean too heavily on how much I like it. I love reading both, but soft world building is kind of where my interests lie. So some examples of soft world building are Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. This is actually my favorite book growing up, and it's also my favorite Studio Ghibli movie. And I will touch on that in a second. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is another fantastic example of soft world building. And lastly, I actually put in here a movie. It's Spirited Away by Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli. And the reason I put Spirited Away instead of something like Harry Potter is because Hayao Miyazaki, like Tolkien, is kind of the father of soft world building. He's almost created it as a genre. Everything that he does is soft world building. And if you are familiar with his work, you understand what I'm talking about. And one interesting bit of information I did want to mention is that when Hayao Miyazaki decided to go and meet Diana Wynne Jones to create the movie Howl's Moving Castle, she actually confessed to him that her book was inspired by his movie Laputa Castle in the Sky, which is why the worlds they feel so similar. Like they're not the same, but they're built in the exact same way. So she actually was inspired by Hayao Miyazaki to create this book, which is why it became a movie. All right, so soft world building uses the unknown and the imaginative. Wow, that is a really hard word to say when you're nervous. It uses the unknown and the imaginative with flexible rules in order to immerse your reader. And what I mean by that is that it creates this sense of enchantment and otherworldliness that kind of pulls your reader in and makes them curious. I just said otherworldliness. It uses otherworldliness and defies logic. So you can literally have whales floating through the air, dropping bombs on cities, as you have in Howl's Moving Castle, and you don't question it because it's Howl's Moving Castle. You're already immersed in that world, and you just accept it. And while hard world building makes the world into a character, in soft world building, the characters make the world. And I'll go into this in a little more detail, but what I mean by this is that you learn about the world through the characters rather than through the narration. So you learn about the world based on how they interact with it. And I have one quote that I took, which is actually the introduction of Howl's Moving Castle. And I think it's a great example of how just through the character's eyes, you immediately understand how the world works. So in the land of Ingary, where such things as 7-league boots and cloaks of invisibility really exist, it is quite a misfortune to be born the eldest of 3. Everyone knows you are the one who will fail first and worst if 3 of you set out to seek your fortunes. Sophie Hatter was the eldest of 3 sisters. Now this is the opening paragraph and then the next line of Howl's Moving Castle. And for me, at least, like as soon as I read this, I kind of got a feeling of what this world was like. It's superstitious. Magic exists and people don't question it. So you already know that going right into the story with 3 sentences. So soft world building has flexible rules. And what I mean by that is that when you create your soft world building world, you don't have to create an entire hierarchy and logic, and you don't have to have all these rules set out. You can create the world as you go and bend it to fit your story rather than bending your story to fit your world. It uses atmosphere and mystery in order to create that feeling of unknown and otherworldliness. And a fantastic example of that is Howl's Door in Howl's Moving Castle. Now, if you've read the book versus if you've seen the movie, the door is a little different. But basically how it works is that there's a knob, and surrounding the knob, there are 4 blobs of paint. Each color goes to a different location, and there's one blob of paint that's black. And you don't find out in either until toward the end where it goes. Now, in the movie, you don't really understand where it goes. Howl goes through it, and he's suddenly just in the sky fighting a war. In the book, it actually takes him to an entirely different dimension. And I'm not going to give anything away because I highly, highly encourage you to read this book, especially if you want to write fantasy. It is just absolutely inspirational, and it's written for young adults and children, so it's an easy, quick read, but it's mystifying. So Howl's Door, he goes through this door and he is in an entirely different dimension, and you never question it when you're reading this book because it fits in with the rest of the story. Like, everything is this bizarre, so you don't question it when Howl's traveling through dimensions by walking through this door that leads to a bunch of different places. Another great example is the wastes, and instead of talking about it right now, I'm going to go to my next point because I kind of bring it up again. Soft world building uses the reader's imaginative involvement to help create the world. And what I mean by that is exactly what I was saying, the wastes. What do the wastes look like? If you've read the book or if you've seen the movie, you know that the wastes are never described and they're never really shown. In the movie, when Sophie opens the door at one point, there's mist all around her and you see hills. That is all you know of the wastes. In the book, all you know about the wastes is that they exist on the edge of a flower field and the Witch of the Wastes lives there. You don't have to know what it looks like. You don't have to know what it smells like. You don't have to know what happens there. You just know that it's the wastes. The name in itself gives it away. The fact that people fear it so much gives away everything you need to know. So the wastes look different to everybody who sees that movie or reads that book. Like, they have it in their head. And that is how soft world building works. You allow your reader to imagine what they want to imagine, and you allow the story to evolve, and your reader adjusts their vision with the story. And it's another great way to immerse your reader that is completely different from hard world building. Not better, just different. In soft world building, you have a lot of creative freedom, and you have all that creative freedom because you're using the reader's imagination. Howl traveling through worlds unquestioned, for example. Nobody questions it. I think there's only one point where Sophie's curious as to where she is when they go through the door. But otherwise, they don't ask why it works that way or how it works. It just does. It's magic. You accept it. Soft world building leaves room for possibility. And this is where I'm going to touch on Harry Potter very briefly. Harry Potter is a great example of soft world building, but J.K. Rowling's urge to kind of clarify things that happened after the books came out kind of damaged her soft world building, in my opinion. And what I mean by that is room for possibility in soft world building means you can build your world as you write your story. So in the case of Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling created the first book, and then she went into the second book and added to the world. And in the third book, she just kept adding and adding and adding. And it worked out really well for her because then she never had to worry about the story or the world from the first books interrupting her story from later books. She didn't have to worry about things correlating because she built it as she went. And that is a fantastic method, especially if you're not somebody that can just sit and plot for forever. I feel like soft world building tends to lean itself towards people who are like pantsers or plantsers, whereas hard world building is definitely like a plotter type of method. Okay, I said again, I'm sorry. Soft world building uses themes lacking logic and realism, and I discussed that already, but basically you don't have to have logic. As long as the story makes sense, the characters are believable people, the world doesn't need logic. In Howl's Moving Castle, there are flying whales, There are shooting stars that become demons. Howl swallows a shooting star, and you don't question it. It's just part of the story. And like I said before, the characters make the world. And I already touched on that with that quote. But basically, your characters, the way they interact, the things they talk about, their fears, their interactions with other characters, that is what creates the world for you. So you're allowed to imagine yourself in that world and you see it the way you want to see it. So how do you use soft world building, I hate that word now, to create your worlds? First of all, you use the unknown to create atmosphere. So you're going to intentionally leave out information. You may have the world already created in your head, but you don't have to tell your readers about it. You're letting them be mystified. You're allowing mystery and the unknown to create an atmosphere of otherworldliness. And that's kind of what makes it so enchanting. You encourage your reader to suspend disbelief. And this is a phrase that comes up a lot in writing. And basically what it means is that you want your reader to just believe the things you're telling them when they come into the story. And more logical readers might not be able to do that. A great example of this, and this is not soft world building, but is a great example of suspending disbelief, is when you go see the movie The Exorcist. When you're watching that movie, exorcisms exist. Demons exist. Whether you believe in them in real life or not, while you're watching that movie, they exist. And if you're somebody that is frightened by that movie, you have suspended your disbelief so well that whether you believe in demons or not, when you leave that movie, you're still terrified. And that, I think, is a fantastic example of suspending disbelief. It allows and invites speculation. And what I mean by this is that you are literally encouraging your readers to question things and be curious about things and wonder about things. And that's what adds to your story. Instead of taking away from it, unless you have a super logical reader, it's going to increase the mystification and the otherworldliness and the enchantment of your reader reading your story. It creates possibility and wonder. And again, I touched on this before, but when you are soft world building, you're creating a possibility for the reader to kind of build in the story on their own. They become curious, they add things their own, they're wondrous about this world, they want to learn more. And I think in soft world building, that can really enhance your story. I hope I kind of explained that well enough, because now I'm actually going to jump into the middle way. And not everybody can do hard world building, not everybody can do soft world building. So there is a middle ground, because world building is a spectrum. There's no right or wrong way. There is always like a middle direction that you can kind of go on. This middle way is actually kind of more what I use. I'm a plantser when I write. That's why I kind of stuck my map in here as like an example. I'm a great example of the middle way. Not that you are familiar with my writing, but this is what I do, so I'll be able to talk about it more easily. The middle way is often called Hemingway's iceberg method. Hemingway, if you know anything about him, Ernest Hemingway is a famous American author. Before he was writing books, he was a journalist. And he learned that when you're writing, all you need to do is give the facts. You don't have to give the whole backstory. You don't have to give context. In journalism, you give the facts. You don't worry about interpretation. You just write the facts. This is the story. This is what's currently important. And this iceberg method is very much that. It follows very much that kind of train of thinking. It's called the iceberg method because, as you know, there's that whole theory of the iceberg and the water levels here, and you only see the tip of the iceberg. Everything below that is what you as the author know. Everything above that is what your reader has to know. So they only know like 10% of the story. This method is actually used by Neil Gaiman. So if you're a fan of his, you already know what I'm talking about. Basically, with this middle way, this iceberg method, the author knows everything, but they share a small amount. And this kind of is why it falls into the middle and why it's good for people who are kind of in the middle of plotter and pantser. So if you are a plantser, as we like to call them, you like to plot out your stuff, but you still like to give yourself kind of room to shift things. And this method is great for that. Because you construct your entire world, but you only reveal what's necessary for the story. And not only does that allow you to change things if you need to, as long as they haven't been revealed, but it allows you to surprise your readers and keep that kind of feeling of wonder and enchantment and mystery while still having something concrete underneath you while you're writing. So if you are a pantser and you like to just control the aesthetic of what you are writing, then soft world building is going to be your thing. If you're a plotter and you want your world to be realistic and believable and like richly detailed, then hard world building is for you. But if you're somewhere in the middle, then this kind of middle ground is going to be the best way for you. And I encourage you to practice. I encourage you to read books that use these different methods. Read the books I suggested in here and get an idea of what the worlds feel like. And I think you'll kind of understand which one is best for you. So these are just kind of the things I want you to take away from this little chat is that hard world building creates immersion with concrete rules, whereas soft world building has flexible rules. We already talked about what it means, but just to go over it again, hard world building, you create concrete rules for your world. With soft, you don't create those hard rules. Everything is flexible, everything can be changed, and nothing has logic to it. In hard world building, you're giving the reader consistency, whereas in soft world building, you're giving them a sense of the unknown. In hard world building, you're grounding your reader, and specifically, you're grounding them by creating this world that's like their own. Whereas in soft world building, you're encouraging your reader to use their imagination. In hard world building, you're using logic and realism. In soft world building, you're literally defying and lacking logic. You're just kind of making it up as you go, and your reader's just going to go with the flow. In hard world building, you have a realistic world, and that is the important thing. It doesn't matter if there are dragons or spaceships or fairies. It's realistic because the characters are realistic and it's relatable to their own life. Whereas in soft world building, nothing has to be realistic. There's a feeling of otherworldliness. If the story is good and the characters are well made, and you have this world that is not defined, it's okay because you're intentionally giving that feeling. So I hope this was helpful. As you can see here, my raffle world is atmosphere. So if you're interested in entering my raffle, you can throw that word in there. Hopefully that's easy to remember because I was talking about soft world building and hard world building and atmosphere. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. I'm going to scroll through the chat here because Maddie is standing over there. So, all right. So Jess asked, can an author use these soft or hard world building techniques for writing any genre, or are there world building techniques that are specific only to sci-fi and fantasy? These can absolutely be used for any genre. I happen to be a sci-fi fantasy writer. That's what I delve into. So I use those as examples here. But if you're writing something that's not either of those, you can still use either of these methods. I think if you're writing something that is modern and realistic, then you don't really have to do a lot of world building because you're already writing in the current world, but you still have to create the world of your characters. And when you do that, you're obviously going to use whichever method works best for you. I think that I'm going to suggest some books for you guys to like look into, and I'm going to suggest some websites that have lots of information about world building, but it does not have to be science fiction or fantasy related. It just is most common in those genres. And Steve wants to know, does your approach change from book to book, or are you locked into one? It definitely changes from book to book. Like I'm definitely kind of a middle ground person, but in my novel that I'm working on, my novel series, The Daffodil Witch, I think I'm leaning more towards soft world building than kind of that iceberg method in that one. That one is set in a completely made up island that exists in our actual world. So I'm allowed to do soft world building there because you already have the real world that exists around it, but the laws of magic and everything are completely soft world built. Whereas in this series, I think I'm definitely like a middle ground kind of world building, because this one, while it also exists in the real world, it takes place in this Fey dimension. So in there, I definitely did the iceberg method where I have the entire hierarchy figured out, but because it's told through the eyes of the main character, you're only seeing little bits and pieces of it, and you're only learning about it as you go through the story. So I think that's where my methods definitely differ from book to book. Does anybody else? You guys can unmute yourselves if you want to ask anything too. You're welcome, Steve. And if there are no other questions, we can.
How about the link? The raffle link?
Oh yeah, I can insert the raffle link again. So If you guys want to enter my raffle, again, the word is atmosphere. So just click on the link and you'll want to put in your email address and the raffle word. You can enter more than one raffle. You're not just like stuck entering only the one. There's like few enough of you that you can enter all of them. And I think I will give it over to Maddie.
I have a question.
All right.
Would you like from the peanut gallery off to the side, you have some excellent audiobook for the Unseelie Prince. How did you go about choosing a narrator?
So that was actually really hard. So if you're interested in audiobooks, I personally love audiobooks. They're my favorite because I'm in the car constantly. I sew on the side. I'm always cleaning. So I get to listen to books when I'm doing anything. And because of that, I can actually read 3-4 books in a week. And I can blast through tons of books that way. And yes, audiobooks are the same as reading real books. Don't let anybody tell you that they are not. But when I created this book, The Unseelie Prince, I knew I wanted an audiobook because for me, audiobooks are everything. So it's like, I have to create an audiobook. I self-published this book, so I had to be completely responsible for the audiobook. This is a novella, so it's only 2.5 hours long if you listen to the audiobook. So for me, it was a little less expensive. But the way you do audiobooks, there's you can go through Audible or you can go through Tandor. Most people go through Audible because that's owned by Amazon and it's just a little easier. But Tandor is another method or another place you can go if you're not wanting to hop into Amazon. So the way it works is that you sign up on ACX and I put a section of my book in there as like an audition. And I put down that I needed somebody with an English accent that could do Scottish accents and American accents, because those are all important to my book. I put in a section that had multiple characters speaking so that I could hear him do the different voices. And I think I had about 10 people who applied within a few days. So by the end of the week, I had already made a decision. I did not think it was going to happen that fast, but it does. So different narrators will read what your book is about, and they will read the audition that you give them. They'll send you a recording, and you get to listen to them and decide which one you like. You get to decide whose voice you like. If somebody mispronounces something or they've said something and you just didn't like the way it sounded, but you like everything else, you can actually ask them to reapply and like send you a second audition. I didn't need to do that. There was one author that stuck out, one narrator specifically that stuck out to me the most, and I chose him. And then he recorded the audiobook. For me, it was a very fast process because he did his own recording, his own editing, and then his own like he did everything on his own and then just sent it back to me. So I actually had my book up, I think a month after I paid him, which was very quick. It usually does not happen that quick. There are 2 ways of paying your narrator. If you're an established author, which I am not, you can actually do royalty share, and I believe that's actually what James does. James, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think James is able to do royalty share with his narrators, and that means that whenever somebody buys your book, they get part of the royalty, and then you get part of the royalty. I am not well known enough to do that, so I had to pay my narrator like cash up front, which gets expensive, but I think it was worth it for me. James actually said Find Away Voices is another place that you can hire your narrator. So there's obviously different places you can go. Pammy, hi Pammy. She wants to know, in total, what did it cost you to, as a self-published author, to produce the audiobook? My audiobook cost me $750 American dollars. And I say American dollars because my narrator lives in the UK, so I had to do the conversion. So it's expensive. I think the average is, I want to say it's like $250 or $300 to $300, or it's $250 to $400 per hour, so per read hour, and that's with all the editing and everything. Mine was about 2.5 hours, which is why it cost me $750. So if it's a longer book, it's going to cost a lot. It's going to get up into the thousands, which I think that's kind of where traditional publishing can be helpful if you want audiobooks. Otherwise, you just really have to work and establish yourself as a self-published writer, get your books out there, get selling, and if you're selling enough, then the narrators are going to be willing to do royalty share, and if they are, then you don't pay them. They just get paid whenever the book is bought. So yeah,
Can Can I
Yeah,
jump in
go
there
ahead.
for you, Katie? So for the cost that you pay per finished hour, right? And so the narrator sets what they want to be the per finished
Yep.
hour. So some narrators will take royalty share, some will take what they call royalty share plus, which is where they take royalty share, but then you also pay them a stipend. Others will not do royalty share or royalty share plus at all. They want you to pay them up
Yep.
front. So if it's a shorter book, like a novella or something like that, then you can pay for it up front. So my fourth book in my Archer Heathland series, I think I paid him like $500 to do the whole thing, but it's a shorter book. When it comes to longer books, when you've got 300 pages and it's going to be an 11-hour book, if they're only charging $100 per finished hour, which is actually pretty cheap, that's still $1,100.
Yep.
And to make that money back on an audiobook is going to take you probably years, unless you have a big audience you're going to sell several hundred right away. So I've used mostly royalty share for most of my stuff. And the secret about that is that up and coming narrators are often very interested in building their own list. And so you can often get a really solid beginning narrator who may not have a lot of experience, but they can do a great job for you and they'll do a royalty share. So most of mine are royalty share. There's a couple that I paid up front, and I paid them because I wanted to use them everywhere. So if you go on Findaway Voices, you can go. They disperse to just about every place in the audiobook universe. Even they'll disperse onto ACX for you. You can avoid ACX entirely if you want to by going on Findaway Voices, and they'll send it to them. Or if you do royalty share, then usually you're stuck in ACX if you're doing royalty share, because that way you're exclusive on ACX with that book. So you have to remember that just in deciding what you want to do.
Awesome. Thank you so much, James. And we can always hit this topic again if anyone has questions on audiobooks, publishing, anything at 4 o'clock with the group author panel. We're going to do a quick seat change here, so everyone hold tight. Thank you so much, Caitlin Abdou.